Tabea and respectful greetings, ladies and gentlemen, my indigenous and diplomatic relations, and particularly the people of Marafenfen. For the past days, I've received numerous reports, videos, and articles of the ongoing protests following the verdict by the Dobo District Court on November 17th, where the villages of Marafenfen lost a land dispute from the Indonesian Provincial Government and Navy. The dispute over the indigenous lands has continued for decades. The lands where for centuries the villagers of Marafenfen have lived, hunted, and gathered. And so this dispute and developing situation isn't an isolated incident. I see the situation of the Marafenfen community in my work as an indigenous rights advocate repeated every day around the world again and again and again. And it has much to do with the rights and fundamental freedoms of indigenous peoples that are in one way or another being ignored or violated. Moreover, all these cases I've seen should be viewed in the larger context of colonization, racial discrimination, oppression, injustice, and other structural violations and non-recognition of indigenous peoples' rights. So which is why I intend to address the people of Maluku, the villages of Marafenfen, and you in this short video. You see, the court's decision sends an alarming signal on Indonesia's intentions to uphold its international human rights obligations. It is worth reminding Indonesia that it has legal obligations under numerous international human rights instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also its obligations under the human rights treaties it has ratified, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So in my examination of the situation, through the reports and articles that I've received, there are several standards and obligations that have been violated. So in this message, I will highlight three key areas: self-determination, lands, territories, and resources, and human rights and indigenous rights defenders. So let me start with self-determination. Self-determination is a collective right. It is the foundation, the backbone, the ink from which all other indigenous rights are written with. It is a prerequisite to the exercise and enjoyment of all other human and indigenous rights. The self in self-determination means that indigenous peoples choose their own destiny and choose to represent themselves and their own interests. Self-determination also means that when their collective rights are being violated, that the legal processes, mechanisms, and other institutions need to be adjusted or enhanced in the most broadest and most flexible way to allow genuine access and participation for the processes and institutions of indigenous peoples. In my view, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a normative framework. It was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007, in which Indonesia voted in the affirmative, and this instrument elaborates upon existing binding rights in the specific cultural, historical, social, and economic circumstances of indigenous peoples. Self-determination is spelled out in Article 3, which provides that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and that by virtue of that right, they can freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The right to self-determination of peoples is also stipulated under Articles 1 of both ICESCR and ICCPR. It protects indigenous peoples from certain forms of dispossession, from the territories or the resources upon which they depend. And in addition, Article 1, in conjunction with Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, guarantees the right of people to maintain their cultural connections, including their way of life, over the lands and resources upon which they rely. In light of the violation of the Marafenfen's right to self-determination, it is important, very important, to highlight that the larger context remains that the indigenous peoples and territories of Maluku which includes the Marafenfen village, have been forcibly annexed into the Republic of Indonesia after an incomplete decolonization process as a former colony of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the 1950s. And this historic injustice has created a domino effect throughout time and the Maluku Islands and abroad of further provocation, conflict, and deprivation of the full enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the indigenous peoples of Maluku. On lands, territories, and resources, I'd like to highlight a number of other provisions of the Declaration related to the rights of indigenous peoples to the land, territories, and resources, quote, which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired, unquote, which they may own, use, develop, and control. It's important to see that this right stems from indigenous people's right to self-determination. You see, every right in the UN Declaration is connected to each other, just like our indigenous worldview. So the UN Declaration imposes that the lands, territories, and resources of indigenous peoples and their laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems to be recognized. For example, Article 32 states that indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. The Declaration also prohibits any forcible removal of indigenous peoples from their lands or territories, imposing requirements of free, prior, and informed consent, agreement on just and fair compensation, and, where possible, the option of return for relocations. For example, Article 8 provides that states should prohibit any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing indigenous peoples of their lands, territories, and resources. The right of the indigenous Marafenfen villagers to their lands is also enunciated in the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which Indonesia ratified in 1999. This convention recommends states to recognize and protect the rights of all indigenous communities to own, develop, and control the lands which they traditionally occupy, including water and subsoil resources. Furthermore, in light of its general recommendation, number 23, on indigenous peoples, the committee calls upon state parties to the convention to, amongst others, ensure that members of indigenous peoples have equal rights in respect of effective participation in public life, and that no decisions directly relating to their rights and interests are taken without their informed consent. It also says to ensure that indigenous communities can exercise their rights to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, and to preserve and to practice their languages. And it also says to recognize, to protect the rights of indigenous peoples to own, develop, control, and use their communal lands, territories, and resources, and where they have been deprived of their lands and territories that are traditionally owned or otherwise inhabited are used without their free, prior, and informed consent, to take steps to return those lands and territories. In connection to this, I also highlight the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights General Comment number 21, in which it stated that indigenous peoples had the right to act collectively to ensure respect for their right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. And that states should respect the principle of free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples in all matters covered by their specific rights. It has also come to my attention that individuals are being targeted because of their activities to report and defend the human and indigenous rights of indigenous peoples. In relation to these reports, I bring to your attention UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders Articles 1 and 2, which state that everyone has the right to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international level, and that each state has a prime responsibility and duty to protect, promote, and implement all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Articles 5 and 6 of this declaration are also relevant, as they provide for the rights individually or in association with others at the national and international levels to meet or assemble peacefully, and to seek, obtain, receive, and hold information on human rights, including remedies to claim those rights, and to freely publish and impart or disseminate or others view information and knowledge on human rights. As the indigenous villagers continue to protest the verdict, and supporters, human rights and indigenous rights defenders are amassing in various places, including on the traditional Marafenfen lands, I remind all authorities to particularly respect every individual's right to peaceful assembly, freedom of expression, and Indigenous people's right to self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to participate in matters that affect them, as set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In relation to efforts from the Indonesian authorities to evict the Marafenfen community from their lands, I stress that in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that no removal should occur without meaningful consultations and agreement, and should only occur under just terms and full protection of their rights. Now, additionally, in light of its human rights records, Indonesia should be very conscious of its upcoming UN Universal Periodic Review scheduled for 2022. Mindful that in the previous cycle, Indonesia supported the recommendation to take strong coordinating measures to protect the right to freedom of religion or belief, including by ensuring that all district and provincial laws and regulations align with, inter alia, its international human rights obligations. You see, the current situation of Marafenfen exposes the continuing discrepancies between the commitments to the international peer recommendations and the national actions of the Indonesian government vis-a-vis access to justice, rule of law, and indigenous peoples. I will continue to monitor the developing situation, continue to provide assistance where needed, and to my indigenous and diplomatic relations from all over the world, I humbly request you to do the same. Because that's what indigenous rights and the global indigenous movement is all about. Like I said, Marafenfen is not an isolated incident. Not for Maluku, not for the world. And I will conclude by making it very crystal clear. The rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources doesn't find its origin from a state, nor is it awarded by a state. It stems from the very fact that we are the original people of that land. We have inhabited that land since time immemorial, before colonization, before Europeans and Asians came to Maluku. So to my dear brothers and sisters at Marafenfen, and those that are defending our lands, territories, and resources throughout Maluku, you are within your right to live on the land and to protect it. Not just based on international human rights or your indigenous rights, but based on your rights as the original peoples of the land, as custodians of the traditional lands for our future generations. But we have to work for indigenous rights. We have to claim our rights. Indigenous rights are never welcomed with an open door. You want to win the next case? Go and teach each other about your rights. Go talk to your friends about Marafenfen, about your Marafenfen. Go talk about how you want the future of Marafenfen or Maluku to look like. If you do that, not only will you have a strong legal foundation in the courtroom, you'll also build a strong vision, a strong mindset. You'll build a strong Marafenfen community and a strong foundation for Maluku, and will become a strong family member to other indigenous peoples of the world. I believe we can do this. We'll continue to fight for our indigenous rights, we'll care for the land, and we'll show everyone in Maluku and the rest of the world why indigenous peoples remain the best guardians of our environment. And to all my foreign relations, I know you care, I know everyone knows their own Marafenfen. So we can do this. Because if we all do this, we will win in the future. Matebulu.